Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, welcome. My name is Kiana and I do a lot of sewing and fashion videos, and today I have a tutorial on this bubble dress. This bubble dress actually comes in two variations, style A, which is the bubble dress, and style B, which is this A-line dress with a ruffle trim. The sewing pattern for this is the first link down below, and as always, I love to reward those who are subscribed with their notification bells turned on, so if you use the code BUBBLE, you'll get 30% off on this pattern until tomorrow at midnight. This is an intermediate level pattern, and as always, I'll have all the supplies and materials needed for this project in the listing description of this pattern, which is that first link down below. Anyways, without further ado, let's just get into the tutorial. All right, so first off, print out your pattern at 100% scale, but make sure you're also paying attention to the printing instructions so that you don't accidentally print all the sheets of paper. Now just line up your pieces of paper edge to edge without overlapping or trimming down the paper. Use those lettered and numbered diamonds to help you align everything and then tape it together. Make sure you're referencing your instruction manual for your size before choosing a size and cutting it out. For reference, I'm choosing to create a US size 0. Also make sure that you're paying attention to those pattern details, what fabrics to cut. Make sure you're paying attention to the notches so that you can mark everything, especially those darts on the skirt. All right, we're gonna start off with style A. If you're choosing to create style B, just skip forward in the video. All right, so first thing we're gonna do is sew the bodice. And it always really helps me when I'm working with something with a lot of bodice pieces to have everything laid out nicely beforehand so I can stay organized. So I'm just gonna organize both the shell and the lining, and then I'm going to sew up all those vertical seam lines, and of course, sew right sides together. Then just notch your curves before pressing those seams open. Now we're ready to attach the boning. So just cut your boning to the length of each of those vertical seams. You only have to do this for either the lining or the shell. I decided to place the boning on the shell for the black dress, but on this pink dress, I decided to put the boning on the lining to give it some structure without the boning being visible. Once you cut out all the boning to size, bring it over to your iron and just press everything flat. Then remove the boning from the casing, and you're going to stitch the casing down on each one of those vertical bodice seams. I like to pin the casing in place, and it takes me a while to pin the casing down just because I want to make sure it's exactly centered on each seam, so I really take my time with this. Once the casing is pinned on each seam, bring it over to your sewing machine and just top stitch that in place. Top stitch along the edge of the boning channels, and that will secure it to the bodice. After you've attached all of your boning channels, you can just pop back in those boning pieces, and now you have a boned bodice. Next, grab the skirt lining and pin and sew those darts before pressing them to the center. Now I'm just gonna serge the sides of the skirt lining independently so that those edges are finished before I sew the side seams. Now you can place the front skirt and the back skirt lining right sides together and sew along those side seams. But this is very important. You're going to leave a gap in one of the side seams. So sew the top of the side seam, leave a gap between those notches, and then sew the bottom of the side seam. And then press those side seams open. And then we're gonna do the same thing to the shell skirt, except we're not gonna leave a gap. So serge those side seams independently and then place them right sides together and sew and press those seams. Now we're going to add basting stitches to gather the waistline. So add 2 basting stitches to the waist. If you don't know how to do gathers, lengthen your stitch to the longest stitch setting on your sewing machine. Do not backstitch at the beginning or end of your stitch. Make sure your stitches are within the seam allowance and leave those thread tails really long so that you can grab them later on. I also like to start and end my gathering stitches about 5/8 to 3/4 of an inch away from the center back seam, because later on when we add the zipper, there won't be as much fullness around the zipper, and then that zipper can lay really flat. So that's just a little pro tip that I like. So grab the bobbin threads of the basting stitch and just start pulling them, and it will start gathering the skirt. You want to gather the waist of the skirt to match the waist of the bodice shell. So I'm just placing those together and kind of gathering it until it fits into that measurement. Once it fits, just tie off the ends of your thread so it doesn't go anywhere, and then pin everything in place. Now you can sew and then serge this seam. Now attaching the lining skirt to the lining bodice is a little bit easier. No gathering necessary, just place them right sides together, pin, and then sew, and then serge. Now we're going to serge all of the center back edges of the dress independently. So serge the shell, and then also you're going to do this for the lining. This is going to prepare for installation of the invisible zipper. Now we're going to install the invisible zipper into the shell of the dress. If you know how to install an invisible zipper, great, go ahead and do it. If not, here's a good tip. I prefer to baste in the zipper in my sewing machine first. So I baste in one side of the zipper and then zip up the zipper. I use either chalk or pins to mark where the waist is and where the zipper stops. Then I unzip my zipper, flip it over to the other side, and pin that in place using the marks to line everything up. Then I baste this side. And then once it's basted in and you check to make sure all of the seams match up, you can go ahead and sew it in for real with either your zipper foot or invisible zipper foot. After that, just sew closed the bottom of the skirt underneath the invisible zipper. And of course, make sure you are pressing all of your seams. Now unzip your zipper fully because we are going to attach the lining and the shell dresses together. Make sure you roll out your zipper so the fabric is laying completely flat. That is something a lot of people get a little confused on. So yeah, just make sure you roll out the zipper so the fabric is flat. Then place your shell and your lining right sides together, and we're going to pin along the center back seam through the zipper. You will only be able to pin down to the zipper stop. Now we're going to sew the shell and the lining together along that center back seam with 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just 1/4 inch. After that, we want to close up the rest of the lining center back seam below the zipper. So just place the lining right sides together and pin that as far as you can from the hem all the way up to the zipper stop, and then you're gonna sew that seam closed. Now just pin along the neckline and then sew, and optional, you can serge the neckline. I did it on this one, I didn't do it on style B, but not optional is clipping and notching into those curves. So I notch around the outside curves and I clipped along the inside curves, and then of course I clipped my corners. Make sure you're not clipping through any of those stitches. One of the sides has 3 stitches, so just look at that side and make sure you're not clipping through your stitch lines. Then you can press the neckline and flip the dress right side out. Now we're going to prep the hem of the skirt for gathers just like we did the waistline. So we are going to sew 2 rows of basting stitches in the seam allowance at the hem. I'm starting and stopping these stitches at the center back seam. Now we're going to pull on the bobbin threads and start gathering the skirt. We want the bubble skirt to fit into the measurement of the lining skirt hem. Now this step can be easy if you take your time, but if you rush through, it's gonna be harder. So make sure, please take your time. Just gather the fabric and make sure it fits into that lining hem measurement perfectly. We're gathering it with the dress right side out, even though that's not how we're going to sew it, just because it's way easier to get everything situated now. So again, make that measurement match the hem measurement, and then tie off all your threads so the measurement doesn't change. And then I like to pin it at the side seams, at the center back seam, and at the center front of the dress. And now I want you to watch what I'm doing very carefully. At each of those places where we've pinned, take the pin out, grab the shell and the lining, and turn them in towards each other so they're facing right sides together. Pinch it and then pull it out, and then pin those 2 pieces right sides together. So before, when we pinned everything in quarters, everything was pinned wrong sides together. Doing this allows you to pin the pieces of fabric right side together. So again, watch what I'm going to do. I'm pulling out the pin, I'm grabbing the shell with one hand, I'm grabbing the lining with the other hand, I'm placing them right sides together, and then pinch it with one hand before pulling it out so that you can see those hems. Grab your pin and pin it together right sides together. You're gonna do this at all 4 places that you had pinned. So the side seams, the center back, and the center front. Now this is kind of where the magic happens. So unzip your dress and remember that gap we left in the lining earlier. Stick your hand through that gap and grab the hem. So any of those areas where you just pinned, those 4 pins, just grab the hem and pull the hem back through that gap in the lining. Listen to me, you are not going to be able to pull the entirety of the hem back through that gap in the lining, which is fine. You will still be able to sew that whole hem. My advice to you is to sew a quarter of the hem at one time. So remember how we divided the hem into quarters? Take a quarter, pin the hem, and then sew that quarter of the hem. Now 1/4 is done. Then move on to the second quarter. Pin that and then sew it. That is the easiest way to do it, and you do not need to understand the concept of this closed loop dress system in order to be able to sew it. The reason why I want you to go in quarters, or you could do halves of the dress, I did half of the dress at one time, is because you cannot fully pull through this hem. So it's very challenging to sew the entire hem all at once. So I would do half and half, or if you're really struggling, 1/4 at a time. Now just also serge this seam, and then you can pull everything so it's right side out. And the very last step to this dress is to now finally close up that hole that we left in the lining. You can either hand stitch this, or it's okay if you also just want to top stitch this closed. And that is what I opted for. But after that step, you are done with your bubble dress, and that concludes the tutorial for style A. Now the tutorial for style B. So first I'm going to start with the bodice. I'm going to be doing something called flat lining for the bodice shells. So I'm taking the bodice shell, placing it right on top of the bodice lining. Both fabrics should be facing right side up, and I'm going to stay stitch in the seam allowance with a basting stitch around the entirety of each bodice piece. This is called flat lining, which is basically just combining two pieces of fabric so that they can be treated like one piece of fabric. After you've done this to each bodice piece, just make sure you give it a really good press. You want everything to be nice and molded together so that it really just feels like working with one piece of fabric. Now that you've flatlined the shell, go ahead and sew up each of those vertical seam lines. Now just press your seams open. Now we're gonna move on to the bodice lining. We're gonna sew all those vertical seam lines, but I am sewing the bodice pieces all wrong sides together. This is going to make sense later on. I would watch the full tutorial for style B first before sewing so you can understand why we're doing this, so that you can make your decision on whether or not you want to do it this way. So watch the tutorial first, please. Now moving on to the skirt, we're going to sew the darts on both the skirt lining and the skirt shell. And this skirt we are sewing with right sides together for the darts, so the skirt should look opposite than the bodice. See how the bodice is more of a matte satin where the seams are, but the skirt has the shinier satin side where the seam is? That's correct, they should be opposite like this. Now for the skirt, we're going to sew the side seams, but we are going to use French seams on the side seams. So for French seams, you are going to place the skirt pieces wrong sides together and then sew with 1/4 inch seam allowance on these side seams. After you've sewn, you can trim down the seam allowance to be 1/8 of an inch. So trim it about in half. Then press that seam open and then flip the fabric around so it's right sides together and give it a press. Now sew with 1/4 inch seam allowance one more time at this seam, and this is a French seam. What you are left with is a fully enclosed and finished seam that is perfect for see-through fabrics like chiffon. Now for the lining skirt, I'm going to serge all of those side seam edges independently first to prepare it for sewing. Once I do that, you can place the front and back skirt lining right sides together, pin, and then sew, and then press those seams open. Now take the lining skirts and bodice and place them together at the waistline. Now I want you to look at the seams of the garment. Don't pay attention to the face of the fabric, look at the seams of the garment. I'm gonna call the side of the seam with the seam allowance the wrong side of the seam, and the side of the seam with no seam allowance as the right side of the seam. We want the wrong side of the seam for the skirt to be face up and the right side of the seam for the bodice to be face up, just like how you see here. Now take the bodice, flip it over, and line it up with the skirt at the waistline and pin that in place. Then you're gonna sew and serge the waistline, and then very important, press the waistline upwards. Now the shell is a bit easier. Just place the bodice shell and the bodice skirt right sides together and pin, sew, and serge the waistline. And then again, make sure you press that waist seam upwards. Now we're going to serge all the center back edges of the dress independently to prepare it for the invisible zipper installation. So do this for the shell and the lining. Now install the invisible zipper in the shell. I gave a pretty detailed tutorial of this in style A, so if you're not sure how to insert an invisible zipper, definitely rewind and go check out the detailed tutorial in style A, and then close up the center back seam below the zipper of the shell by just sewing it together. Make sure your zipper is closed before trimming off the excess zipper. Now moving on to the straps. We are going to sew all of the straps with French seams along the long edges. So remember how I just taught you how to do French seams for the skirt shell? You are going to use that same seam type to sew the straps. Once the straps are sewn, on one edge of each strap, you are going to turn the edge in, flip it inside of itself about a ½ inch. Once you flip it in, you can press it and then just either top stitch or hand stitch that to finish the edge. Now we have 4 straps. The short straps are for the front and the long straps are for the back. Take the shorter straps and place them at the front princess seams, right in the middle, and pin them in place. For the back straps, place them at those back strap notches and pin them in place. I'm going to stay stitch these straps in place in the seam allowance just to make it a little bit easier for myself when I sew the neckline. Now we're going to take the shell of the dress and the lining of the dress and place them right sides together and pin along the neckline and the center back seam from the neckline down to where the zipper stop is. When I say right side of the lining, you can kind of see what I'm doing because you know it's confusing with the right side and the wrong side of the lining. So you can see which side I have face to face with the shell. So just go ahead and copy me. Now you're going to sew along the center back seam with 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then along the neckline with 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then back down the other side, the center back seam with 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then you're going to close up the bottom of the lining skirt below the zipper by just placing that center back seam together and sewing from the zipper stop down to the hem. Now you want to clip your corners, notch your outside curves, and clip your inside curves before pressing that neckline and turning it right side out. Now we're almost there. The last thing we need to add is the ruffle. So take your ruffle front and back and place them wrong sides together because we're going to sew these side seams with a French seam. So sew those 2 short edges using a French seam. Now we're going to hem the ruffle first before we gather and attach it. So we are going to use a rolled hem for this. To do a rolled hem, press the hem under 1 inch, then bring it to your sewing machine and sew 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of that hem. Then you're going to trim the seam allowance down really close to the seam that you just sewed, as close as you can get it to that seam without clipping into that seam. Be very careful not to cut through the seam. Then bring it back to your iron. Roll that seam under 1 more time, press it so it should look like a really thin, tiny seam now, then bring it back to your sewing machine and just top stitch that in place to finish your rolled hem. Now we're going to prepare the top of this ruffle to be gathered. So I did go through a detailed tutorial on how to do gathers in style A. If you don't know how to create gathers, go ahead and rewind to that part in style A. Basically, you're just going to sew 2 rows of basting stitches in the seam allowance without back stitching, and then pull on those bobbin threads to start gathering the fabric. You want it to gather up to be the same width as the hem on your shell skirt. Tie off the ends of the threads. Then just place the ruffle to the shell right sides together, pin it, sew it, serge it, and then press it. I am also choosing to press that ruffle flat with my iron just because I don't like the super voluminous, puffy look it gives. So I am choosing to press that entire ruffle flat. And the last step is to hem the lining. So you have 1/2 inch hem allowance, so just turn it up 1/4 inch twice, press it, and sew it. Now here's the explanation of why we had that whole right side, wrong side confusing lining situation at the beginning. Because the shell is sheer, we are seeing that lining skirts through the chiffon shell fabric. So we don't want the seams shown through the skirt. So that's the reason we had to sew the skirt the opposite as the bodice. Another funky thing, since we flatlined the top with the right side of the lining facing out, we also wanted the lining skirts shiny side facing out so that the shiny skirt would be facing out and the shiny bodice would be facing out when you're wearing the garment. So that's why we have the matte side of the charmeuse fabric facing the body. I hope that makes sense. But those are the reasons why we did what we did. All right, so that is how you sew this dress. Let me know which is your favorite, style A or style B. I love the drama of style A, but I would definitely wear style B every day. Don't forget the pattern for this is the first link down below, and you can use the code BUBBLE to get 30% off this pattern until tomorrow at midnight. If you make this dress and post it on Instagram, don't forget to tag me because I love seeing what you guys create. And if you're not following me on Instagram, feel free to follow me. My Instagram and TikTok is Kiana Bonollo. If you like this video, feel free to give me a thumbs up because it's the easiest way to support your favorite creators for free. Also, make sure you're subscribed and have those notifications turned on so you don't miss out on discounts in the future. But I think that's everything, so thank you so much for watching. Bye!